I guess East Coast Jew, simple thing. Born in Pennsylvania, raised in Rochester, New York, and high school in northern New Jersey. Thank you, Jon Stewart, for saying it's okay to be from New Jersey. And I had my grandfather was a Hasidic Rebbe, but not in a Hasidic community. So I had some exposure to a very sort of religious fanaticism from the Jewish view. And it was very interesting in retrospect. But I was raised as a conservative Jew, so not particularly religious, but I went to Hebrew school and hated most of it, like all my friends. But I was bar mitzvahed, and I chanted both the Haftorah and the Torah because I was into the chanting. I was definitely a Umze, some pre-Umze training in the Jewish thing. And I think I was also somewhat inoculated about practicing in a foreign language that I did not understand, because I did not understand Hebrew hardly at all, much as they tried to teach us. And as I became more curious in reading the other side of the page where the English was, I became a little less interested in the whole thing. So I'm a very firm believer in practicing in your native language whenever possible. No more mumbo jumbo. As a child of the 50s and 60s, the Woodstock generation, and I did go there, many of us were interested in Eastern things. And in high school, I read D.T. Suzuki and Alan Watts, and they were very helpful and interesting. We debated all sorts of things with my friends. And in college, I was a student of Swami Satchidananda, a fairly well-known Hindu yoga teacher. I was not a close student of his, like some of my friends I later got to know, but he was a very wonderful, good influence, both in terms of the physical hatha yoga, but also more meditation. And that inspired me to learn Sanskrit. Somewhat because I was bored in college, and unlike some of my friends, I was not really wanting to drop out. I wasn't quite that radical or adventurous. And so I wanted to find something that would occupy me. And Sanskrit, I had heard, was a very difficult language. And although I had studied a few languages, I had not really done very well with any of them. So I was intimidated. And I went to go see the teacher who was going to teach Sanskrit. And it was obviously an auspicious coincidence of finding him in his office. I later understood it may have been the only time he was in his office over the 4 years I was in college. And I said to him, I heard Sanskrit's very difficult language. And he said, well, how did you pass your language requirement here? I said, well, I'm Russian. Oh, much easier than Russian. No big deal. And I said, well, why is it that people say Sanskrit is so difficult? He said, this is a myth promoted by Sanskritists for their own ego. That got me. That was the hook that kind of, all right. Now, he turned out to be lying through his teeth. Sanskrit is considerably more difficult than Russian, I think. But he got me. And he was a very good teacher, even though quite eccentric. And I enjoyed Sanskrit. It was fun, and it really has served me well to some degree. I never got particularly proficient. I did about 2.5 years of Sanskrit and a little Pali, even a little Vedic Sanskrit. And to translate Buddhist texts with some knowledge of Sanskrit, especially for those who focused on Tibetan, is hugely helpful. So I really recommend that all Tibetan translators, people translating Tibetan Buddhist texts, they really should have at least a year of Sanskrit. So that happened in college. I became a student of Trungpa Rinpoche, the Vidyadhara Chogyam Trungpa, sort of in the middle of my college time. And that, of course, inspired me to want to learn Tibetan. But Tibetan was not offered at the University of Michigan, nor is it in hardly any universities in North America. It's very rare. So I couldn't really pursue that until later. Yeah. But it was definitely the Hindu yoga thing that began really, and I took the course, there were a couple courses in Buddhism, and after becoming a student of Trungpa Rinpoche, then I was much more focused on Buddhism, and fortunately a professor from the University of California, Lou Lancaster from Berkeley, came to be a visiting scholar and offered a graduate seminar, mostly in Chinese. I didn't know or was motivated about Chinese, but he allowed me to come to the seminar and read the same text in Sanskrit, along with about 5 or 6 people reading. Each one had a different translation of the Diamond Cutter Sutra, Vajrachetika. So we would go around the room, and each person would offer some version of what their text said, and I supposedly had the original, and then each of the others had different Chinese translations. This was fabulous. I learned a lot. It was a lot of fun, and Professor Lancaster was a really supportive, really good teacher. And I had to produce an edition of, I think, 6 or 7 Sanskrit manuscripts. Little old me, some little Sanskrit student, had to decide which the best reading was of all these variant readings. Very, difficult, presumptuous, but you learn a lot in trying to see, well, what would be grammatically more correct. It was in the days of typewriters, so you had to kind of roll the carriage back and type a hyphen over all the, the macrons, and roll it the other way to type a period under all the retroflex. It was enough to drive you mad. I had 30 pages of Sanskrit to type. At any rate, I learned a lot. It was really good. Yes, I was a beginning student of Tibetan Buddhism, meaning I was beginning to learn how to meditate in the Tibetan style, and I was studying, not Tibetan yet, but Sanskrit Buddhist texts. And, it was terrific. It was really a very good experience. Yeah. Tibetan came later. That didn't really happen until I moved to Boulder, Colorado, which is where the Vidyadhara wanted me to go after college. And that was I finished college in the early part of 73. And Trungpa Rinpoche himself actually taught 2 classes in Tibetan to 5 or 6 of us that were interested. He was not really a language teacher, but it was fun. We read the Kagyu Lineage Supplication, Dorje Changtunma, it's known as. We already knew it very well in English. Reading it in the original was exciting and fun, and it was like, how could you not want to do this? You learn Dharma. So I would say most of us were aspiring to learn Tibetan because it was a wonderful way to study and learn more Dharma. We were not particularly wanting to become translators, most of us that were in that. It really was just, those of us who were interested in such things. I'm not sure how to answer this question because it depends a lot on what you're really wanting to accomplish. If you're a scholar, the challenges are huge because most of the Tibetan literature that was translated, the Kanjur, the Tenjur, Jur means translated, so these are all the words of the Buddha and the commentaries of his many Indian disciples. So translating texts that are from either of those canonical collections, I think requires a knowledge of Sanskrit at least, maybe other Prakrits, like Apabhramsha and other related Indian languages. And that's very challenging. I think the greatest challenges for translators is really learning the languages well enough to be inside them enough to then be able to express them in another language. And I don't think I have really accomplished that much. So there's a lot you can do without being that inside of the other culture, because I think that's what we've done. But the more you can get inside it, I think the better you can be as a translator. And, I'm still in the realm of what a lot of people call translatorese, that is a bridge between the original and the vernacular target language. And because we're doing Buddhist texts, and because the texts are many times very technical, with a lot of vocabulary that ordinary Tibetans would not know, you could say there's an excuse for why the target language also has a technical vocabulary that is not totally vernacular. And we're doing this somewhat because we're the bridge from one culture to another, from one understanding to another. And even though it may not be as beautiful as it could be, we hoped it's very accurate. So we strive for accuracy. So it's a challenge to, there's so many things that you have to either compromise or, make a choice. But learning the languages is certainly the biggest challenge. And trying to figure out who your audience is. Who are you actually speaking or writing to? Is it primarily Buddhists who are practitioners? Is it primarily academics, scholars? The Nalanda Translation Committee that I am the director of, we try to do things primarily for the practitioner in a way that would be acceptable by a scholar without all the scholarly apparatus that they would normally expect. So that's our decision, which we came to very much in concert with Trungpa Rinpoche and have tried to continue. I think the reason to translate Buddhist texts is to make the teachings available to another culture for those people who want access to the sort of the actual guts of the tradition. It is a tradition that it has a huge literature in many different languages, and Tibetan is a very large literature. Even though a lot of it's repetitive, it's still very vast. And so if a practitioner wants the wealth of knowledge and methodology of practice, there's a lot to translate. And I think really the main purpose is to awaken people. Just like the Buddha means awakened one, somebody who woke up. That's what we're all after. We're all trying to wake up and be more aware. And the Buddhist tradition has developed, I think, a lot of amazing methodologies toward that. Many of those do not require texts, but there's a lot of information in the text that are very helpful. Not just sort of arcane historical references, but actually very useful, practical wisdom. So, if somebody wants to actually embody that and understand it, they need the resources of the literature, because that is really what contains, I think, the lineage of transmission and tradition that has gone on now for 2,600 years. The 84,000 project is a very ambitious project, and this is not something that anyone can kind of easily imagine accomplishing without the kind of resources that prevailed in ancient cultures. When the king of Tibet gathered a group of translators at Samye to translate the Indian teachings into Tibetan, you had royal patronage. You had the whole wealth of the culture brought to bear to help and sustain that endeavor, which took a long time. We don't have that kind of patronage. So being able to accomplish this is in many ways more challenging. One of the big questions is, how picky do we want to be about translating these texts? These are texts that are very old, and unfortunately, the living transmission, the living tradition of knowledge of, I think, the overwhelming majority of these texts has disappeared many hundreds of years ago, maybe almost 1,000 years ago, but for sure hundreds of years ago. The most important of these texts, I believe the transmission is very intact by way of commentary, and many of those texts have already been translated. Maybe some of them could use a refreshing, but the majority of these texts really do not have living people who know what they mean, who can explain in detail what every word means. Whereas some of the texts, the most famous of them, can be explained word by word. Now, whether that is the same explanation as would have been given 1,000 years ago, we don't know. But at least there's some continuity there. But the majority of this literature does not have that. So for those of us working on these texts, it's very challenging, very difficult. There's no one alive to ask, what does this really mean? But there are a lot of super smart people, many of them Tibetans, who will probably make a better educated guess than we will, we Westerners. I had a conversation with Gene Smith, a great Tibetan scholar that I hope many of you know about. And this conversation occurred before the 84,000 Project was created, but only a few years before that. He and I were friends, as anyone who works in Tibetan would want to claim friendship of Gene Smith, and he was really friends with hundreds of people, and I'm very fortunate to be one of them. And I asked him, what did he think about this idea of translating the Kanjur? Because I knew it was coming up with Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche and Punlap Rinpoche, and in particular Punlap Rinpoche was the main advocate of this at the time. And we went back and forth about our own feelings about this, whether it was really important or not. But one thing that Gene said to me that I'm reminded of in today's questions is he said, we need to just get it done and make it available and not worry too much about doing a perfect job in the way that an academic Buddhist scholar would. And I think that is crucial. An academic approach to these translations would really take so long. I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I'm just saying it is really, really difficult and requires enormous linguistic knowledge and capability. And there's a limit to what you can really know. Gene really felt we shouldn't do that. We should do what we can, do our best job, put it up on the web, make it available to people, and over time, maybe it will be improved by those people get inspired to want to really do that. So I want to leave you with that. Gene Smith is kind of our mentor for so many things. I think we should follow his advice.